Nigeria's Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is the new Director General of the World Trade Organization. She's the first woman and the first African in the organization's history to assume this position. The organization has never been led by an African, despite Africa representing 20% of its membership. Trade expert and director at Tutwa Consulting Group, Catherine Grant Makokera, joins us to discuss the appointment. Good evening, Catherine, and thank you so much for your time. You know, a lot has been spoken about this nomination process and really how we have ended up here today. And there's been a lot of expectation also about what then, Miss Okonjo-Iweala is going to be able to do in this position. Do you think that she's coming in with an unfair amount of expectation?
Yes, I do, actually. And I think that what we sometimes forget is that she is actually an incredibly strong candidate in her own right. And sometimes because, of course, there has not been a woman in this role before, and there has not been an African in this role before, we sometimes overlook the fact that she is very qualified, very experienced in working in international organizations such as the World Trade Organization. She has experience at both at the national government level as well and in high office in Nigeria. So I think to sort of put those expectations on her of being able to represent the continent, developing countries more actively is a bit unfair, especially given the current state of the organization.
Some have been looking at her experience and role and different roles that she's occupied previously and talking about how she's had the ability of shaking things up, especially in Nigeria, and holding power to account. And there's hope that she will be able to do this at the World Trade Organization. Is it as easy and as simple as that, Catherine?
No, it's not that easy. That's the trouble with the World Trade Organization as well, is it's very much what's called a member-driven organization. So the role of Director General is really to head the secretariat and to action what members agree. And as we know, there's a lot of disagreement right now out there around trade issues. So we've had the tensions between the US and China for a number of years. It's unlikely that those issues are going to disappear with the new Biden administration. The position of China within the World Trade Organization is something that a number of countries actually have some difficulties with. And of course, the fact that the WTO has not been able to really progress new rules for many years now is also a difficult job ahead.
And, you know, it's important that you're raising the fact that much of her work she will take as part of what comes out of the Secretariat. But we also know that some of the developed countries have incredible influence over an organization such as the World Trade Organization. And that's just how it has been over the decades. And, you know, do you see that changing now simply because we do have, you know, that shift in terms of who is appointed to the World Trade Organization, that it doesn't come from the West, it is somebody who is African?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You've hit the nail on the head. The influence of the countries that trade the most is very much felt across the WTO. It's an organization that operates on a consensus decision-making process. And so what often happens, and what has been happening lately, for example, on key issues such as restructuring the dispute settlement process at the WTO, is that one country alone, and in that case, the United States, can hold up the whole process. And so it's not going to be easy for anyone coming into the job of Director General to be able to try and find ways through impasses such as the ones that we've got at the moment. We've also got to remember we have had a Brazilian in the job up until August last year. And so this is coming on the back of already a candidate who comes from an emerging economy, a developing country with strong interests in relation to agricultural trade in particular. And he wasn't able to really break those deadlocks and come up with results that you could say were particularly favorable to developing countries.
So what then becomes a fair barometer that people can use as a gauge to see, you know, to have realistic expectations of what she can do, but I suppose to still also hold her accountable in that role, and I suppose the level of efficiency that she, of course, will have to meet?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the WTO has unfortunately gone backwards in the last, I would say, 6 months or so, with the challenges that we've seen from the United States to the appellate body process, the dispute settlement process that's at the heart of the organization. So one barometer would be to try and resolve that issue, because if the court process, if you like, that helps resolve trade agreements is not functional, then the rules become much less powerful, because you don't have any real accountability or any processes that can help countries hold each other to their commitments. And so I think a key measurable for and Dr. Ngozi will be to see if she can help restore the dispute settlement process. Also, in many respects, the WTO has to undergo some kind of reform if it's to continue to be relevant. And that reform goes beyond just the dispute settlement. It goes into the way that the organization does business. It's an organization that went really from sort of an old boys club back in the day, when it was the GATT, to being an organization now that represents the vast majority of the economies of the world, and countries are still lining up to get into it. But there hasn't been a lot of changes made to the way it does business, to its operating processes, its procedures, how it makes decisions. And we also know that it's got to tackle some new issues. So the issues around electronic commerce, for example, digital trade, which we've seen increase exponentially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So she's got certainly a busy agenda, but I would say she could claim success if she could, at least in the next few years, in her first term, shore up the core tenets of the World Trade Organization, which revolve around rules that can be enforced.
You've raised such an important issue around how traditionally the World Trade Organization has also been very much a boys club. It hasn't really changed much, right? She's still going to have to be faced with many men. You know, she's still outnumbered in terms of her gender when it comes to that organization.
Yeah, it's funny. I started my career, well, within the first 2-3 years of my career, I was at the World Trade Organization as a negotiator in the late 90s. And it was very daunting as a young woman to come into that organization and to be faced with men who had been responsible for negotiating trade agreements for decades, really. And so she's definitely going to face that. There has already been some commentators who have raised questions about her lack of experience directly in the trade space, if you like. So she's going to probably have to also prove herself quite quickly in terms of having a good grasp of some of the more technical aspects of what the World Trade Organization does. But I think it's an extremely positive step that we have got a female leader in this role. It will only be positive for women who are moving into these spaces increasingly, and who really want to be part of what is an incredibly important part of international commerce.
And you know, of course, one of the challenges that faces the world when it comes to women who occupy such senior positions is that often they're held to very different standards to their male counterparts. You know, that some men can be in these positions and be mediocre and get away with it. And, you know, as a woman, as an African woman, that she certainly won't have any room for that. Do you have reason to believe that how she is viewed and perceived will change, that it will be outside of the narrative of what we've seen follow really powerful women?
You know, I'd like to hope that the majority of people will respect her on the basis of her qualifications and her skill set. As I said, she comes in already, regardless of being a woman, regardless of being African, as a super strong candidate in the first place. And so I would hope that everybody would give her the space and the room to come up to speed to demonstrate her abilities. As you said earlier, she's certainly been tested in other roles that she's had, which have also been in very male-dominated environments. It's never easy, is it? And I'm sure she will get a lot of support from people like Christine Lagarde. I see one of your photos here is of Christine Lagarde, and people like that who have come before her in terms of leading international organizations like this. She is joining quite a strong fraternity of women who have been playing in this space, not at the WTO, but in terms of other leading roles at United Nations agencies, for example, at the IMF and in other organizations. So hopefully, if anything, she'll get at least a bit of support from her peers.
Trade expert and director at Tutor Consulting Group, Catherine Grant Makokera, thank you so much for your time tonight.